Hey everyone, and welcome to video 2 for chapter 27, where we're going to be talking about economic and social changes going on in China during the Ming and Qing era. Truth be told, not too many of the social developments were monumental changes at this time. Economic changes did lead to some social shifts, but overall, Chinese society saw a reinforcement of traditional values, such as the patriarchal family. China has long been a patriarchal society. There were prominent women at different times, both in government and in society and so forth. But overall, patriarchal values were reinforced both by Confucianism and beliefs such as filial piety. Now filial piety, hopefully you remember, means respect for your elders. And this cultural value dates back a long time in China, hundreds of years before the period we're talking about now. You were expected to respect your elders, but this mostly applied to the father in the family. It could be very strict as well, penalty of death for children that disrespected their father or went against their father's explicit commands. It also extended to the relationship between subjects and emperors, where the emperor was viewed as being the father of the country, and so subjects were expected to show him that same type of respect. Both household fathers and emperors, they were authoritarian and they demanded respect. Ancestor veneration really only focused on the male line. You didn't worship or you didn't pray to, mom's parents or anything like that. It was only on dad's side. Young girls were taught lessons of children going to extreme. Not just young girls. Young in general were taught lessons of children going to extreme to respect and care for their elders. Look at the picture here of the young person dragging the older guy in the wheelchair. It was meant to set maybe an extreme example, but that was what they taught. That's what you should do for your elders. Girls in particular, though, were taught to be subordinate. Okay, there was a heavy stress on subordination of females during this time. Male children brought honor to the family. Girls did not. Only boys could take the civil service exams. So therefore, girls were looked at as being much more of a burden or a liability. They couldn't really add anything too much to the family. And if you were a lower class, a common one, it was better to have boys because physically they were more helpful for working in the fields. Female infanticide, while not common, it did exist. And on the opposite end of the spectrum of life, when you're old, widows were sometimes encouraged to commit suicide after their husband died, similar to the Indian practice of sati. They were expected to be kind of pretty flowers, right? They were expected to dress well and look nice and just perform womanly duties. The most visible example of them having to look nice and overall of female subordination was the expansion of foot binding. All right, we remember talking about this. It originated in the Song dynasty, but became much more common during the Ming and Qing era. This practice of crippling young girls became a necessary social status for upper class families. Remember, lower class girls didn't really practice it too much since this was necessary because it was necessary for them to move in order to work. And once they did this, once you forced your foot to go down a couple sizes, it literally restricted your movements. Sometimes common families would practice this since they felt that it was necessary it made them more desirable. If a girl was very pretty and they thought that they could marry her off to a richer family, they would do this to them at a young age. Girls with normal sized feet were thought to be undesirable and therefore could not find a husband. And since a woman's life was defined by her husband and his family, unmarried women were social outcasts. Now, economic development. While social values were generally a progression or reinforcement of older values, there was a legitimate change in the economy. Now, much of this was due to the impact of the Columbian Exchange. We remember about the Columbian Exchange, right? Now, when we first learned about it, we looked at it just within the confines of the Atlantic Ocean. But, as you see here, Europe, Africa, and Asia, okay? Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Asia was a part of this. Maybe not directly as connected as Europe and Africa, but still stuff from the Americas. It went across the Pacific and it made its way even through the Atlantic all the way over to places like China and Japan as well. So starting in the 17th century, Spanish merchants, they introduced crops such as maize and sweet potatoes and peanuts, and these supplemented the traditional rice and wheat that was native to China. This increase in food production, it led to a spike in population, right? More food equals more people. The first half of the 18th century alone saw a 40% increase. Now, this did lead to some problems since agriculture couldn't keep pace with the population rise. One benefit of the population increase, though, was an increase in manufacturing. This, in turn, led to a rise in foreign trade. The early Qing dynasty was a pretty prosperous time, largely due to global trade. China had a monopoly on luxury items such as silk and porcelain. It didn't import much, though. It briefly tried to establish an international trade presence under the Ming Emperor Yongle with the voyages of Zheng He. Now, Zheng He, he was an admiral, and he set out on a number of long-distance expeditions between 1405 and 1453, right? You see the years from it. This was used to be a favorite topic to ask on the Regents. This map was from an old Regents exam. Traveled all throughout the South China Sea into what today would be Indonesia, the Strait of Malacca, the Bay of Bengal, all around the Indian Ocean basin, even into the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and along the east coast of Africa. So long voyages, and he led enormous fleets, hundreds of vessels, thousands of men. It was meant to try and impress and leave the foreigners in awe of the power of the Ming Dynasty. Now, this all came to a screeching halt after Zheng He and Yongle both died, and by the 17th century, under the Qing Dynasty, they had placed severe limitations on foreign access. They were really only able to access a couple of ports in the south. You see down here, this one, actually let me move me out of the way, Macau. And even though it's very small, right above Hong Kong, because this is a modern map, so Hong Kong would be the much bigger one, but Guangzhou and Macau were two of the only ports that were open to foreigners. The Dutch had to do all of their business in Macau. The British had to do all of their business in Guangzhou. It's one of the reasons why Hong Kong developed into a British trade site and later a British colony. But you notice how they're all limited to down in here. All right, foreigners were not allowed up around here by Beijing. That was a no-no. It was off limits to them. This was due to very strict government oversight. They also felt that the rest of the world, especially Europe, didn't have much to offer. Even though they didn't sail to India and Africa anymore, Chinese merchants, they still dominated, though, this trade in Southeast Asia. Okay, down around through here, through the Philippines and Indonesia and so forth, they still were doing very good in there. And this is how Chinese goods made it into the Columbian Exchange. Silk and porcelain was sold to Europeans in Indonesia, like the Dutch and the British and so forth, and the Spanish, usually for silver from America. Mexican silver was all throughout China during this time. Also, one interesting aspect of this time was that despite the increase in trade, China saw overall very little technological innovation. The only real changes was the adoption of European-style cannons and guns, which is somewhat ironic because the Chinese invented gunpowder, but were now being left behind in how it was applied. The low levels of innovation in farming and industry was mostly due to the lack of government support in those areas. The Tang and the Song governments actively promoted technology. The Ming and the Qing governments, they just didn't make it a priority. It just wasn't as important for them. And by the 18th century, this ensured a trend of European advancement in technology while China was being left behind. Okay, social classes. Now, the social pyramid in China was very similar to those of every other classic or early modern society. At the top, you have the privileged classes, right? These were your scholar bureaucrats, your gentry, okay, the rich and the wealthy. The gentry were the wealthy landowners. The scholar bureaucrats were a little higher in status. They were really at the top. Most of them came from the gentry, though, so there was a lot of overlap, right? Mostly the wealthy were the ones who could pass the exams. These classes were easily distinguished from others. They dressed better. Okay, you see the all-black uniform of the scholar bureaucrat. You see the fancy clothes of the gentry out here on holiday. They received preferential legal treatment. Okay, they weren't subject to the same type of laws, and they were exempt from certain taxes, which was nice. Now, beneath them were the working classes. Now, you look at the diagram here, and you know that these three are your working classes: artisans, peasants, and merchants. peasants, interestingly enough, were at the top. Now, they were by far the largest of any social class. And the reason they were on the top and given a little higher status in this diagram is because they were considered the most honorable. They did the honest labor, and they provided food for everybody. After them were the artisans, these guys here. This was a pretty wide category. It was skilled laborers. It was workers like craftsmen and tailors. It could even be physicians and doctors. They usually worked for the gentry, though, or for other wealthy merchant families. Now, merchants, hold on, let's get artisans, and then merchants, interestingly enough here, they were the lowest in terms of honor out of the working classes. Now, some of them could be very, very wealthy, so I don't want you to confuse honor and wealth. They were the least honorable because Confucian moralists, right? This all had to do with Confucianism. They viewed them as social parasites that fed off other people's works. They had very little in the way of legal protection, but oftentimes because they were connected to the nobles and the gentry and so forth, especially if they were making those family money, they would give them special protections. And at the very bottom, you had the lower classes. Notice here you have military forces, soldiers. Soldiers were looked at as being a necessary evil by the Confucian moralists. They really held them in contempt. They looked down upon them. And the other were what we call the mean people, slaves being among them. Also indentured servants, prostitutes, beggars, people like that. Okay, so that wraps things up to talk about economy and a bit about society. And then the next video, we will talk about culture and religion in China at this time.